Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you today in this joint webinar. And I see a lot of people I know and the participant, which is great. Welcome to the ATBC ESA webinar on the future of biodiversity in Latin America and the Caribbean. This webinar is a special joint webinar put together by the Neotropical chapter of ATBC and the ESA Latin American and Caribbean chapter. My name is Juan Posada. I'm the co-chair of the ATBC Neotropical chapter. ATBC stands for Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. And our chapter is formed by the chair is Rakan Sahawi, Zach, Natalia Norden, who you just heard, and Patricia Sampaio, and myself. I'm a faculty at the biology department at the University of El Rosario, and my co-host is Enzo Martelli.
Hi, I'm Enzo Martelli. I am the Chilean representative for the Latin American and the Caribbean chapter of the ESA, the Ecological Society of America. Our board at the ESA LAC chapter is formed by the co-chairs Diogo Probete and Marcel Vaz, along with Alejandra Martinez, Aaron Avenger, and Felipe Melo. And I'm also a graduate student at the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation of the University of Montana. So as a preamble for this presentation, both ESA and HTBC are societies formed by individuals concerned with subjects surrounding our planetary biodiversity. And more specifically, our chapter of ESA and HTBC are focused on one of the most diverse regions of the planet, right? Which harbors incredible neotropical and subantarctic ecosystems. So this biodiversity present in our Latin America and Caribbean countries is expressed even beyond our highly diverse flora and fauna. It is also expressed in our highly diverse societies, each with its own culture, values, and accents. We bring one of the many examples of that rich biosocial diversity in the photo of our webinar that shows the future generation of capim dourado harvesters from the Mumbuca community in Jalapão region in Tocantins, Brazil. So with that in mind, and more than an academic discussion about biodiversity, what we want to bring this to discussion is about one of the many aspects of our social biodiversity, guided by researchers working on science, technology, and public policy in Latin America and Caribbean countries. So for today's webinar, we invited 4 speakers who are actively involved on issues related with biodiversity in Latin American and Caribbean countries. And once again, thank you very much for your attending the webinar, and I will pass to Juan to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Enzo. So before I introduce you to our first speaker, I would like to run through some general logistics. So each speaker will have a 50-minute presentation in the same order that they are listed in the flyer. And this will take us the first hour. And thereafter, we'll have an hour-long question and answer session in which any of you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A symbol that you find at the base, at the bottom of the Zoom window. The question and answer session will be moderated by Natalia Norden from the ATBC Neotropical chapter and Alejandra Martinez from the ESA Latin American and Caribbean chapter. And they will take turn to read out each question they receive in the Q&A to our guest speakers. So please make sure when you ask a question that you specify the name of the speaker you're addressing the question to, and or if the question is open to all speakers. So now we're moving on with our first talk. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ana Maria Hernandez. Ana Maria Hernandez is the current chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBS, and she has more than 22 years of experience in the framework of multilateral environmental agreement at binational and regional scales. She has been a researcher in the policy and legislation program of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute, the head of the Office of International Affairs of the Ministry of Environment, Housing and Territorial Development of Colombia, the executive director of the Fundación Natura CERT, head of the Office of International Affairs, Politics and Cooperation of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute. And she also has had the honor of representing Latin America and the Caribbean in the Bureau of the COP of the United Nations Convention Against Desertification and Drought, and the SPAO Protocol of the Cartagena Convention and the IPBS. So, Ana Maria, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Juan, and thank you very much to all of you. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I will share my screen, so maybe I can share with you also with the slides our thoughts and our findings, especially coming from the IPBES. So really, it is incredible how the humanity can change its own capacity to live in harmony with nature is something that we have been looking at the past years, and we have produced a tremendous impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and of course that present also a very, very immense impact in our main survival as human species. So the deterioration of biodiversity and the impacts on the human being is not something theoretical. We have findings, we have evidence, and that is something that we are doing at IPBES. But what is IPBES? And maybe a lot of you are asking about that. If you don't know, IPBES basically is an intergovernmental multilateral platform, but is independent body, is not a political body, it's a body where we talk from science and we try to put together the existing evidence and data that exist around the world and present that data and analysis and knowledge for the decision-making processes around the world, and for the governments, and for the academia, and for different types of the decision makers. We started our work in 2012, but our first program of work was started in 2014, and now since 2019 we started our new rolling program of work. So also the IPBES, wait a minute, that is not going forward. Okay, one of the main deliverables that are well known worldwide coming from IPBES are our assessments. By now, we have produced 8 assessments, starting from 2016. We produced one thematic assessment on pollinators, pollination, and food security and food production, and also a methodological assessment on scenarios and models. In 2018, in our plenary that was held in Medellin, Colombia, the first plenary that we have had until now in the Latin American and Caribbean region, we approved 4 regional assessments, including the assessment for the Americas that I invite you kindly to read. And we also produced a thematic assessment on land degradation and restoration. And the last year, in 2019, we approved the global report, or the global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I will talk about this assessment, especially the findings of this assessment especially, but you can imagine that behind all these assessments, all these reports, and all the other deliverables that we have had the honor to work with more than 1,500 experts worldwide, and authors, and indigenous and local communities, and expert holders, and of course our 137 member states. So we together are trying to put different visions, different knowledges, systems, and trying to build from very different perspectives the most comprehensive results for the decision-making processes. So in the assessments, you will find not only biological scientific data, but also data coming from social sciences, political sciences, economic sciences, and practices and experiences that are very well based on evidence. And what are the radiography that the global assessment are telling to us? So the global assessment highlights that the diversity with the species, within a species, and between species and of ecosystems, as well as many fundamental contributions we derived from nature, are declining fast. It's something that we already know, is not something new. And of course, that means that although we are doing a lot of things, we are not in the right path. We are surviving, yes, as a species, but not truly sustainable. The global assessment, if you read, if you had the opportunity to read the global assessment, and as you said, as you see here, found that already around 1 million species of animal and plants that are studied are at risk of extinction, and also, well, the average of abundance of native species in the most major land-based habitats have fallen by at least 20%, mostly since 1900, and more than 40% of amphibian species and almost 33% of reef-forming corals, and more than a third of all marine mammals are threatened. And I can give you a lot of data that I have already here and that you know quite well. But the important thing here is that we are reconfiguring the biosphere. We are changing the whole planet, and not because only we are changing the land or we are altering the seas, but we are changing behaviors. We are changing the dynamics of the populations. So it's not something easy to understand, all the repercussions that our own behaviors can have in the whole planet. I want to show you also what about this. Well, I know that some of you says how EBES can talk about nature contributions to people, if there are ecosystem services. Well, we are talking about also ecosystem services that are included in the whole range of nature contributions to people, so we are not losing that. But anyway, the global assessment showed that, as you can see here in this slide, that we have lost over the past 50 years, 14 of the out of the 18 contributions which nature provides to people and makes life on the planet possible. And for example, as you see, we have lost regulating contributions such as pollination, or the capacity of nature to regulate air quality or climate. Also, we have lost non-material contributions, such as, the learning and inspiration, the supporting identities, the medical and biochemical and genetic resources that, as you see, are fundamental to our cultural identity and our sense of belonging. And finally, only material contributions to people that you see in these green arrows have increased, including the production of food, fiber, and energy. And you can imagine that they're growing because they're putting pressure in other contributions to people. Anyway, the authors have ranked for the first time at this scale and base and this analysis of available evidence, the 5 direct drivers of change in nature with the largest relative global impact so far. And I highlight the word global because in each country, in each territory, in each region, these direct causes may vary. So at global scale, we found that the most important drivers are land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. But the those 5 direct drivers result from an array of indirect drivers, as you see there, and which are in turn underpinned by societal values and behaviors that include, for example, production and consumption patterns, human population dynamics, trade, technological innovations, and governance, but not only global governance or national governance, but also local governance. So we have to see this in a multi-scale way. And the rate of change in the direct and indirect drivers, of course, are underpinned also by a set of demographic, economic drivers that have increased and for more, will interact in a more complex ways. So, and also at the political point of view, in a political point of view, despite of the progress that a lot of not only countries and formal governmental organizations, but also non-governmental organizations, research institutions, academia, and local communities are putting into the conservation and sustainable use and mobilization, ecological mobilization, yes. Despite of all those efforts, the report finds that the global goals that were approved 10 years ago to meet, to conserve biodiversity are not are not are not reached in this by today. We found that there are very few advances in the 20 Aichi targets that were approved in 2010, and the final review of the achievement of the 2020 of the 20 Aichi targets were going to be reviewed this year, and the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, coming from the Convention on Biological Diversity, showed us 1 month ago that indeed we missed the achievement of the Aichi targets in the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and is the same in the Sustainable Development Goals. We are not doing things right, maybe because the 80% of these SDGs are depending on how we work and we conserve and we treat the biodiversity and ecosystem services. So in the business as usual scenario, well, we are not going to achieve also this international goals. So the problem is not only scientific, but also the problem is well, and is not only an economic issue, but an ecological and environmental issue, but also is a matter that relates to development, to economics, to security, and of course it has social, cultural, and moral also interest. So in that sense, the authors and at large, the IPBES community, and now also other international bodies also are talking about the transformative changes as a need. Transformative change is not only a theory, is not only just to follow a recipe, but it's just what the word means. You know, you cannot behave like you are doing right now, but you have to change your mind. You have to do something better for your own, for your kind, and for the future, and of course for the earth. So you have to transform, and with that you have to change. And one of the main messages is that we can do that only if we work collectively. Collectively as governments, private sector, academia, IPLCs, and other stakeholders, including us as individuals. But we cannot say, really, we cannot say that because I am working with that, the other is the enemy, and I cannot work with, for example, the experts in the mining sector or the experts in the trade sector. We have to sit together and we have to talk together and we have to reach common agreements with the different sectors that use or exploit or conserve biodiversity, because we have common goals at the end. And in doing so, also, we have to understand the leverage points that the IBES is, well, putting here as an example of what we can do for truly achieve transformative changes. And as you can see, we can, for example, integrate the biodiversity discussions and decisions and targets into the other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, energy, climate, finances, fisheries, etc., or embracing different visions of what is a good quality of life, because there are many different visions of qualities of a good quality of life, or good life is. Reduce, as you know, the consumption and the waste, and reduce the inequities, because also the social conflicts are part of the environmental conflicts. You know that they are very linked together. So if we reduce inequities, also we are helping to transform and to change the societal values and to reduce pressure on our environment. In doing so, also, we have to practice justice and inclusion in conservation. And for example, we have also to reduce and harmful subsidies in agriculture or in trade. So there are a lot of things that we can do, that some economic waves are presenting right now, some new alternatives also. Well, there are a lot of ideas around us, and it's important to think about what is the best for our lands, our countries, and of course our way of living. IPBES in particular has a working scenarios, and I don't know if you know our task for scenarios and models, and this work concluded that the win-win scenarios do exist if these levers are activated. So the fact, and I want to end with this, is that we need really to listen to the evidence, to the science, and also to the needs of the society, and take decisions accordingly if we want to have a better and sustainable future. So with this, I end my participation, my presentation, and I really thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Maria, for this great talk. And before introducing our next speakers, I would like to quickly remind you that our speakers will first give their presentations, and then we'll have an hour for question and answers and discussions. And so now I'm pleased to introduce Victor Arroyo Rodriguez. Victor is a faculty member at the Instituto de Investigaciones en Ecosistemas y Sustentabilidad from UNAM. Victor is a tropical landscape ecologist whose research focuses on assessing the contribution of human-modified landscape and habitat fragmentation, in particular to biodiversity conservation. His research addresses the issues from both a plant and primate perspective, and he has worked primarily in southern Mexico and Brazil. So, Victor, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, for this nice presentation, Ana Maria. Very, very nice. And thank you all for your presence, and also to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this interesting webinar. I will share with you some of my thoughts about how can we preserve biodiversity in human modified landscapes. But first, I want to say that most of the ideas and information that I will present here is present in this publication, so you may want to review more details of this topic in this paper. I have divided my presentation in these 5 major topics, the 4 most important steps to preserve biodiversity in human-modified landscapes. In particular, I think we should stop deforestation, also increasing forest cover through restoration, preserving a high number of small forest patches, and finally increasing the quality of the anthropogenic lands. I will end my conclusions using all these steps to design a biodiversity-friendly landscape that is not only friendly for species, for forest species, but also for humans. Well, the first step is quite obvious. We should stop deforestation, because this should be a strong priority. Why? Because there is a strong evidence that deforestation and habitat loss in general is one of the most important drivers of species extinction all around the world, and especially in the tropics. And also because we have lost a lot of forest, too much forest. Some estimations indicate that we have lost about 50% of all trees on Earth since the start of human civilization. And we all know that the deforestation hotspots are nowadays located in the tropics. So we need to stop these trends. In fact, in the last 20 years, we lost in the tropics about between 3 million and 6 million hectares of primary forest each year. So this is like losing between 8,000 and 16,000 hectares per day. This is really amazing and worrying. Also, sadly, is the fact that we have lost 10% of all wilderness areas in the last 20 years, and particularly in tropical regions such as the Amazon basin and Borneo Islands. So we need, if we want to preserve biodiversity, we need to stop these trends. To this end, we need to increase the coverage of tropical protected areas, because the current coverage is really too low. So most forests are really vulnerable to further deforestation. Other kind of conservation measures, like the payment for ecosystem services, can also help to stop deforestation across the globe. And because we have lost a lot of forest, the second step is, of course, increasing the forest that we have lost. How much forest we should restore We think that preserving at least 40% of forest cover is a conservative measure because based on evidence on extinction thresholds, most species tend to disappear in landscapes with less than 30% of forest cover. So to be conservative, we think that preserving at least 40% could be a good measure. However, this is not an strict rule because the extinction thresholds depends or vary among species and also among regions. For example, this study demonstrates that the extinction thresholds are higher when the matrix is composed of homogeneous cattle pastures. So we need to preserve more forest when we have a matrix composed of open areas such as cattle pastures and agricultural lands, especially annual crops. This recommendation of preserving at least 40% of forest cover in the landscape is similar to other proposals. For example, this recent study by Garibaldi and colleagues, they proposed that outside protected areas in working landscapes or in the countryside, we must protect at least 20% of native forest. So considering that we have protected almost 17% of the forest, with this additional 20%, we can reach this almost 40% of forest cover protected. And we have a novel and very interesting proposals to restore, to focus restoration projects in some priority areas. And this recent study by Strasbourg and colleagues demonstrate that by restoring only 15% of converted lands, we can avoid the extinction of 60% of species and also sequester up to 30% of all carbon that was emitted since the Industrial Revolution. So we should prioritize these preservation or restoration projects in these highly priority areas. And what about the configuration of the forest that should be preserved and restored? Well, there is evidence that preserving a higher number of small forest patches may have more benefits for biodiversity than focusing on a few large areas. This is, for example, quite obvious in this review by Lenor Farik of ecological responses to habitat fragmentation. She demonstrates that comparing landscapes with the same amount of habitat here, but with a higher number of patches, the response of biodiversity in general is very weak and not significant. So seems like the configuration of the forest doesn't matter as much as the habitat amount. But when the responses to fragmentation per se are significant, most responses are positive, not negative. So in general, preserving a higher number of smaller patches may have better conservation outcomes than focusing on a few large areas. This evidence is also consistent with the studies about the sloth debate. These studies are at the patch scale, and they are comparing the role of single large reserves or several small ones, totaling the same amount of habitat. And evidence to date on this debate demonstrate that in general, several small patches holds more species than single large reserves. So in general, it's much better to have more patches in the landscape than a few patches but larger. And this is not an isolated case. As you can see below in the slide, there are many other references supporting this. So we think that a mixed strategy of preserving and restoring many small forest patches and a few large patches would be much better for biodiversity conservation than focusing on a few large reserves. But why these small patches are so important for biodiversity? Well, there are many causes, no? Many reasons. For example, when we have more patches in the landscape, we can decrease interpatch isolation distance, and therefore the species are able to find more resources in the landscape. So resources availability is higher in a more fragmented landscape. Also, these small patches can increase landscape heterogeneity because different patches can have different soil types and different vegetation and different resources. So this can provide different resources for forest species and contribute to species coexistence and to increase beta diversity and therefore to gamma diversity in the landscape. These small patches are also very important to decrease anthropogenic pressures on large reserves. Because if we do, for example, hunting and logging in these small patches, we can free these large reserves from these threats. Small patches, and especially the riparian forest strips, can also be very important for protecting water bodies, and also they can cool the weather, they can increase air temperatures in the world landscape, and with this, they can decrease heat effects in the world landscape, at the landscape scale. Small patches can also prevent the spreading of risk of many diseases, for example, and parasites and all these threats, and finally can also provide many complementary and supplementary resources to forest species. So in general, we should increase the value, the conservation value of these small patches in conservation and also restoration projects. And the last but not less important step is increasing the quality of the anthropogenic lands. But why is this so important? Well, the anthropogenic lands, we know that they can determine the health effects. So the environmental conditions, the biotic and abiotic conditions that are within the patches and outside the forest can be higher when the matrix has a higher contrast with the interior of the forest. So this is very important to maintain. This is why it's very important to maintain some tree cover in the matrix. The anthropogenic matrix is also very important because it can drive the connectivity and resource availability to forest species across the landscapes. So when we don't have any tree cover in the matrix, also we cannot have a lot of connectivity and resources availability for forest species in the landscape. So in general, we need to increase the quality of the matrix, and to this end, we can follow these 3 steps. First, we need to maintain a low contrast matrix, for example, with agroforestry systems and tree plantations, because this can reduce negative health effects and increase connectivity and resource availability. We can create also semi-natural corridors, such as these ones in Costa Rica, with living fences that can be used by forest species to move across the landscape and also to use different resources within them. Also, these semi-natural corridors can provide many ecosystem services. And finally, I want to note the importance of isolated trees in the matrix, because they can be used by forest species as steep stones to move between different patches. They can also be used as shelter and also as food resources for many species, and they also provide many ecosystem services. So in general, these are the 3 main steps to increase matrix quality for forest species. Well, with all these steps in mind, we can conclude, therefore, how can we construct or design an optimal landscape scenario for both biodiversity and humans? This is how biodiversity-friendly landscapes looks. This landscape has 40% of forest cover, but most of this forest cover is in a large number of small forest patches. As you can see here, the matrix is highly heterogeneous with different land covers, and intensive agriculture is present but occupies a small portion of the landscape. And in general, we think that it's very important to promote many tree elements in the landscape, like isolated trees and living fences. This landscape is not only important for for biodiversity, but also for humans, because they can deliver a lot of goods and services like the one that Ana Maria showed us. So we think that these kind of landscapes are not only important for forest species, but they can provide needs to transform continuous forests to these human-modified landscapes. Because as I stated in my first step, stopping deforestation is a top priority. We rather suggest some rules to improve the quality of already transformed human-modified landscapes. So if we have a landscape like this with 20% of forest cover, we can increase forest cover to increase the persistence of forest species, to the distress, for example, forest 40% of forest cover. But if we do these restoration projects in a higher number of smaller forest patches, and if we include in this the riparian corridors and semi-natural treat elements, we will have a higher conservation outcomes. So that's all the ones that I want to share with you, and I am open to any question later. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Victor, for your very interesting talk. Our third speaker today is Dr. Michelle Scobie. Michelle is a lecturer and researcher at the Institute of International Relations at the University of West Indies in St. Augustine, and is also a co-editor of the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy. She has practiced as an attorney at law in Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, and she's also a member of the Caribbean Studies Association, the International Studies Association, the University of West Indies Oceans Governance Network, Earth System Governance Global Research Alliance, and, oh, I'm sorry about that, guys, the Future Earth Ocean Knowledge Action Network, and the International Studies Association. Her research areas include international law, international environmental law, and developing states' perspectives on global and regional environmental governance. Part of her study interests are shown in her most recent book, Global Environmental Governance and Small States, Architectures and Agency in the Caribbean. Her presentation is titled Global Environmental Governance in Small States, Biodiversity Governance in the Insular Caribbean. Please welcome Dr. Michelle Scobie.
Oh, thank you very much, Enzo. Thank you for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to make a presentation today. And I really congratulate those who've spoken ahead of me for your fantastic presentations, which I think show the importance of the issue of biodiversity as colleagues who work in science and in policy. So my presentation today is going to be on, I've changed the topic a little bit, thinking about what biodiversity is and biodiversity governance, particularly for the Caribbean small island developing states. And I want to put this study, my area of interest, I'm just putting on a timer to keep myself to time. My area of interest has always been governance, so I'm approaching this not from the natural sciences, but from the perspective of global environmental governance. And what we've seen is that since the beginning of time, the human race has depended upon the environment for our existence. And civilizations throughout time have caused and been affected by environmental degradation. And my book, which is Global Environmental Governance in Small States, Architectures and Agency in the Caribbean, it's both for policymakers and for academics, and what it tries to do is to point to those key elements that we need for better environmental governance, absolutely necessary for governance of biodiversity in our region. We've seen that humanity has been guided by and shaped cultural norms and moral and ethical laws that today refer to how we treat the planet and how we treat the environment. And we have our activities have irreversible impacts on the environment, as we just saw from the last presentation on forests. And we academics have begun to call this period the Anthropocene. And although the geologists might argue that it's not a new geological epoch, it is an area where the anthropogenic impacts on natural systems, we've seen that they're lasting, that the societal demand and the moral and ethical and economic political solutions become even more important. We've also seen that there have been more crises, complex environmental crises involving different relationships of actors from global to national to international. We've also seen that even between human beings and between human beings and nature, from local to international scales, there's more of this conflict. So faced with this reality, how do we move to better governance of biodiversity? Well, I argue that we need to engage from both national to global to local scales. And for a long time, this dynamic has been missing when we've come to analyze the reality of biodiversity, especially in small island developing states. The Caribbean, which is my area of focus, is a very complex one. The Caribbean Sea, as you know better than me, you natural scientists know better than me, is an area of complex, very rich biodiversity. But it's also an area encompassing 38 different countries, each with different capacities, different political, historical, social, cultural backgrounds. And that political complexity is important to understand the region. It's important to understand the ability of the region to solve its complex problems together. I have in the top left corner a map of the shipping routes, and that tells you about the economic importance of the Caribbean. Our Caribbean region is one of the areas of the most intense shipping. Think about the implications that that has for the global economic systems, but also for the ecosystems that are so fragile in the region. And so we face the reality of that complexity, that diversity, that the need to have multiple overlapping regimes. In this small space, we have the maritime regime, we have the environmental regimes with UNEP, etc. But we also have the historical regimes aimed at protecting, for example, heritage within the region. And then you have tourism being another important, trade being another. So we have all these regimes, and we can't begin to solve the biodiversity issues without acknowledging all of these actors. And for that, my book goes into, and I consider it sort of crucial for environmental governance, to begin looking at the key themes, the key governance themes. And I divide it into 3 sections: governance, building blocks, and thematic foundations. The first is governance. And there I speak to the fact that there are multiple inputs. In any environmental solution, we need to think about the actors, but also the forums. We need to think about the complex causalities. If I build a seawall in this area, what implications will that have for ecosystems in that area? Is that a permanent solution? And then conflicting agendas. As I would show in my presentation in the future, sustainable tourism can mean 3 things. Sustainable economic success, which is bringing more and more tourists to get more money. But wait, the environmentalists and the conservationists say, no, sustainable means fewer tourists. So you have complex, conflicting agendas. And we also have contested solutions precisely because many of the challenges still lack scientific certainty, because implementation is difficult in our countries with limited resources, and also compliance, how hard it is sometimes to ensure compliance and enforcement. So that's the first level, the governance challenges. On top of that, we have building blocks, the importance of context. One solution, as my colleague from IPES knows very well, that may work in one context would be absolutely useless in another. So again, we need to look at context. We need to look at frameworks on which governance structures work at the national level, at the subnational level. The issues of power, we can't sit at the table without acknowledging the power differentials. The quality, how do we measure quality? Is it sufficient to have a project to protect biodiversity? Or do we need to find ways to measure how to make that project really be sustainable and long-term? How do we measure quality? And then norms. To what extent are global norms supporting? And to what extent are global norms conflicting with national norms that may actually provide greater knowledge and protection to biodiversity? So we have governance, we have building blocks, and on top of that, we have what I call the thematic foundations. And there, we need to recognize regimes. We have complex regimes, complex groups of actors with a common interest in one area of activity that impacts upon the environment. And we have multiple regimes. As I said, we have the trade regime, we have the tourism regime, we have the conservationists, we have the fishing, we have the maritime transport. So many of these regimes that are interconnected. We also have the issue of the relationships and the structures and the agency within these issues. That complexity becomes therefore a staple, a key element to understand environmental governance at all. And then the importance of regional government and the need for South-South cooperation, as many of my colleagues are also speaking to, and underneath all of the sustainable development. How do we support biodiversity and continue providing for the development of our countries? Looking particularly at small island developing states, the question becomes, what's biodiversity policy? Well, biodiversity policy is nestled within many other elements. And maybe the first thing we think about would be the SDGs. But the SDGs are just part of a bigger picture. For small island developing states, the key development policy was what we came up with together in 2014, 1 year before the SDGs in Samoa. That charted the direction and progress for small island developing states, for short SIDS. And that's called the SIDS Accelerated Modalities Action Pathway. And we see that many of the goals that small island developing states throughout the world set for themselves are quite clearly articulated with biodiversity. Desertification, land degradation, drought, invasive species, for example, and then the means of implementation, including partnerships, etc. But wait, if you're speaking to people from the Caribbean, the small island developing states of the Caribbean, we also have another set of policies that sit below that. And these Caribbean islands together in 2013 came up with this landmark document that showed our interest in sustainable development and what were the priorities for us. And I'll just list the highlights. Capacity building, which is so important to achieve any policy, research and innovation, and the need for better data. Data for decision making, that often we lack the capacity and also the tools to get the quality and the extent of the data that's needed. The importance of having energy policy and revitalization of the agricultural sector. And right away, you see how all of these tie into biodiversity. Interesting as well, we have the support of the UN General Assembly with that special resolution recognizing the Caribbean Sea as a special area in the context of sustainable development. So again, we can't begin to study biodiversity policy without understanding the wider political framework within all of these, sits. So my book tries to draw attention to these elements. And it's good for policymakers to think, how does the local articulate with the global? What environmental norms drive behavior? And which ones stop the development of better conservation and protection? To what extent do contexts matter? And what should we expect? How can we see things moving forward in terms of biodiversity in island states? And now I just want to shift gears a little bit in the time that's left and to look at some particular examples of how certain areas of sustainable development become important for biodiversity governance. One, of course, is trade. And trade includes so many actors, as I was mentioning some of them already, from conservation to energy security. Many of the trade rules affect biodiversity. We have the issues of biotrade and biosafety principles, and the Caribbean islands are coming to terms with improving the import rules to protect local biodiversity from imports. But that's something we need to keep an eye on. And another thing, of course, is the benefit of the private sector introducing their own voluntary standards, because sometimes we think, okay, what is the state doing? What legislation is the state incorporating? And often as small states and developing states, we can leverage the private sector that produce voluntary standards, and therefore the consumers can speak with their capacity to pay to ensure that our region isn't flooded with products that can affect negatively the local biodiversity that we have. And that's being done in other countries as well. No? Throughout Europe, for example, the European Union applies, and this is WTO compliant, the precautionary principle under international environmental law. And therefore it requires trading partners to ratify the Convention on Biodiversity as a condition to have lower agricultural tariffs, because they know that in that way, they are protecting the biodiversity in their own region. And we can think about examples like this as ways to protect our region. We have to be careful with biotrade, we have to be careful with genetically modified organisms and living modified organisms as LMOs, as they introduce perhaps organisms into our region that can have harmful effects on biodiversity, invasive species, etc. Heritage governance. Many times we don't think about this as related to biodiversity, but as a region, we enjoy substantial amounts of natural heritage, and that's protected under international law. We have the UNESCO conventions protecting heritage, and we can also look to those conventions and to the support given under those conventions for conserving and monitoring our natural heritage as a way to leverage the international support as well for the protection of biodiversity. Moving on quickly, marine governance, I kind of touched on this before. I can't stress how important this is. We need to get a better handle on marine governance, and precisely because it's so complex, we have so many actors being involved, our resource limitations, complex legal and institutional arrangements, complexity of geopolitical boundaries, and the mammals and the fish in our waters do not recognize these, but are so affected by what individual states do. We have this new convention being negotiated now on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And all of these things affect the biodiversity of the country, of the planet, and our future generations depend on our being active in these forums as well to ensure that they have what they need for the future. Tourism, as I said before, sustainable tourism. This is a difficult one because many island states depend so heavily on tourism. How do we ensure that we get the tourists while protecting the environment, while we ensure social sustainability? And to some extent, I must say that some persons are trying to do that. Some small businesses are trying to engage in ecotourism. But what my research has shown me is that often they find it difficult to balance the environmental sustainability with the economic sustainability. Sorry, I have to run through all of this. Each of these are dealt with in more detail in the different chapters in my book. This is my last slide. And the question is, what does the future hold for biodiversity governance in Caribbean, small island developing states? I like to say that small states, developing states, are architects of their own future. They have agency within the international system and can contribute to decision making at the global level that can impact on their national policies. Their powerlessness in face of large anthropogenic risks by the larger global system can be channeled towards solving problems on the ground if there's this approach of governance that takes into account the different levels and the different contexts and realities that we face. So we need to engage in a conscious effort to improve our adaptiveness and our resilience to many of these effects, climate change, for example, the economic forces, to call out more issues of a lack of environmental justice. We didn't create many of these global problems, and we want to be part of the solution, but we demand that other states more responsible should stand up and take responsibility and also bear the burden of the cost of many of these challenges to our biodiversity as we speak. So the region is fertile. It's a fantastic time to look to biodiversity governance in the present and the future. And I encourage all of those listening to join us or join my colleagues in our continual effort to improve governance of biodiversity in the region. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for your talk and enriching the discussion between the ecological perspective of conservation and environmental governance. For our final talk, let me introduce you Dr. Julia Shimbo. Julia is an ecologist researcher at the non-governmental organization Amazon Environmental Research Institute and a scientific coordinator of MapBiomas in Brazil, a collaborative network of institutions that generates Brazil's annual land use and land cover maps from 1985 onwards. Some of Dr. Chimbo's projects include having worked in the land use change and forestry sector of the third national inventory of anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases in Brazil by the Brazilian Research Network on Global Climate Change. Also, she's been part of the team in the land use change sector of the System for Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Removal Estimates in Brazil, a platform developed by Brazilian NGOs under the umbrella of the Brazilian Climate Observatory. Dr. Chimbo works focused mainly on understanding the land use change in Brazil and their impacts on climate change, GHG emissions, ecosystems, and people. Her presentation is titled MapBiomas Initiative, 3 Decades of Land Use and Land Cover Changes in Brazilian Biomes. Please welcome Dr. Julia Chimbo.
Okay, are you looking at my screen? Is that all right?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you. I'm going to present the MapBiomas Initiative, the 3 decades of land use and land cover change in the Brazilian biomes and its relation with biodiversity. MapBiomas is a multi-institutional network involving NGOs, universities, and tech companies dedicated to map land cover land use change in Brazil. It's an initiative of the Climate Observatory and the SEG. And MapBiomas was created initially to provide information about the land use sector greenhouse gas emissions, but then has expanded to other applications, as I'm going to show later, including biodiversity. It has institutional support of some institutions, as it is a network and not an institution, and a group of founders that support the initiative and the mapping. But how we are organized? We are organized involving local institutions that map native vegetations and other institutions map cross-cutting teams. For example, in the Amazon, the native vegetation is mapped by the NGO Amazon. In the Cerrado biome, the native vegetation is mapped by IPAN, where I am a researcher. And the cross-cutting team, for example, pasture is mapped by the laboratory LAPIG, and that it's from the University of Goiás. Since 2015, the collections of MapBiomas has evolved through time. So we can see the first collection where we have just 7 classes in a shorter period. And then we were increasing the classes of mapping and increasing also the periods. Now we are on the collection 5 with 21 classes covering a period of 35 years from 1985 until 2019 with 3 new classes: soybean, sugarcane, and other annual crops. The MapBiomas mapping is based on Landsat images with 30 meters resolution. The process is pixel by pixel and involves, as I told you, a collaborative network of institutions and a machine learning. We use machine learning and cloud-based processing in the Google Earth engine. So each institution produces their maps from agriculture, mangrove, that is very important for the biodiversity, biomes, pasture, planted forest, urban, and the other classes. And we combine all these annual maps from the institutions in a final annual map of land use and land cover. So here we can see the native vegetation decrease, and also the increasing of agriculture and pasture over these 3 decades in Brazil. A lot of change. And the collection 5 of MapBiomas has a global occurrence of 9%. You can access the occurrence analysis of the maps in the MapBiomas website. This is part of the platform where you can select the classes of land use and land cover in different levels of the legend, and also choose select a territory, for example, a biome, a state, a municipality, or a land tenure category, like protected areas, indigenous lands. And also you can select the years and have the data, the statistical data regarding to this area that you choose. But here's an example of shingle basin area in Mato Grosso in 1985. And then we can see the difference later in 2019, where we see the expansion of agriculture and pasture around the indigenous land. This is quite impressive if you go and change over the years and see the change in land use in these shingle bases, and also the importance of the protected area of indigenous people. So later we combine with these land cover and land use maps to produce the transition information, where we can see the transitions from forest that was converted to agriculture, or the forest that was converted to water, for example, and we have the statistics of all the transitions. And we can see, for example, the forest, the amount of area of forest in 1985 that remained forest, or the amount of forest that were converted to farming areas. And all this data you can download from the platform. Here's a little bit about the results of the collection 5. So we can see that from 1985 until 2019, Brazil lost 7 million hectares of native vegetation, with 90% was converted to farming. That increased about 78 million hectares. In 2019, Brazil had 566 million hectares covered by native vegetation, representing 66.5% of the country, while farming represents 30% of Brazil territory. Another product that we have from the annual land cover and land use maps is that we produce the vegetation loss, deforestation data, and also the secondary vegetation gain and loss information. We can also see the deforestation in the secondary vegetation. And it's an important new layer that MapBiomas is providing in the platform. And we can also see the age of the secondary vegetation. Here's a quick example so that we can see that over the biomes, the increase of anthropogenic use and the decrease of primary vegetation over the time series. But in some biomes, the increase of secondary vegetation, for example, in the Atlantic forest and in the Caatinga biome. But how much do we have of native vegetation in each Brazilian biome? The Amazon and the Pantanal biomes are covered with more native vegetation, while Atlantic forest with less preserved. And we can also see that Brazil is not covered only by forest types, but also by savanna, grasslands, and other natural formations. And the proportion of these types of formations are different between biomes. But we can see here that Amazon, we still have 8% of native vegetation, in Pantanal 84%, but we also need to evaluate how protected are these biomes and its remaining vegetation, for example, by protected areas. So here we can see the evolution of natural and anthropic areas by biomes and the different patterns between biomes, with most recent native vegetation conversion in the Amazon, in the Cerrado, and in the Pantanal biomes, and the proportion of native vegetation and anthropogenic areas in each biomes. And here it's the increase of farming in these biomes, not only pasture, that it's in the dark orange, and the agriculture, for example, that it's the pink, and the difference between biomes, farming patterns. All these data are available in the MapBiomas platform, and all the methods, scripts, maps, statistics are freely available to download as well. With that, the MapBiomas network has expanded to other countries, involving and training local institutions to map land cover land use changes in Brazil. The Pan-Amazon and the Chaco region, they are in the collection 2. The Pan-Amazon, the data is collection 2 is already available in the platform, and the Chaco collection 2 is going to be released in the end of this month, I think. Atlantic Forest, Pampa, Trinational, and Indonesia are going to publish the first collection of maps at the end of this year. And these are the local institutions involving the MapBiomas network in other countries. And as all these maps and data are freely and transparent available, we did a survey and we have more than 300 scientific publications citing or using MapBiomas data since the first collection. Most of these papers involve young and national researchers, which makes us happy on contribution to science in Brazil with hard times nowadays. And it's in these we are not counting, for example, theses, dissertations, books, and reports. But MapBiomas networks also publish some papers about the methods and results, but it's interesting that we release the data before we publish because we want that the data needs to be used for more people and more institutions. In addition to contribution to science, MapBiomas data is being used by several applications in public policies, both by governmental and non-government institutions, and also in the national, international institutions and private sector. It's not just to have the data, the tool and the technology available, but the most important thing is that these data, maps and scientific papers are being used by people and institutions to make effective changes. One example here related with biodiversity, for example, is that the Ministry of Environment in Brazil used the MapBiomas maps to define priority areas of conservation. Another example related with biodiversity is that the IUCN report is using the MapBiomas data to analyze the endangered species in the endangered ecosystems. And regarding biodiversity, we have more than 50 scientific papers using or mention MapBiomas. So from the 300 papers, 50 are related with biodiversity. And most of them related with species distribution modeling. For example, plants, birds, frogs, fish, bees, beetles, butterflies, ants, mammals, such as bats. And it's interesting that I think the first paper of biodiversity that used MapBiomas data used the collection 1 of MapBiomas that was by Leonardo Trevelin. And it was really interesting to have that he was using the collection 1 of MapBiomas, the beta version of our maps in his paper of bats. And jaguars, monkeys, and zooplankton across Brazil and covering all the Brazilian biomes. Another example of application of land use in land cover maps is the fauna monitoring. Here are some students. For example, we have this one that's monitoring of jaguars and mercury contamination and its relation with land use change in Pantanal, where we produced a short documentary that is available on YouTube. That is a work from the NGO On Safari. Another good example is about roadkills of fox species that can be related with land use change in Brazil. And this work was the first place in the young categories of MapBiomas Award. Another interesting applications is the invasion biology, for example, alien fish in reservoirs in Atlantic Forest. And the other one related with fish as well, with fish communities, the impact of land use trajectories along the MapBiomas time series on the fish communities in Pampa. So we can see these examples in different approaches and applications, and also in different environments and biomes. And another case of impact of land use change in the biodiversity is this paper that won the second place in the MapBiomas Award, that it was made by the Professor Thomas, that involved 70 authors and used MapBiomas data. That was a multi-taxa analysis to evaluate the negative indirect effects of habitat loss, fragmentation, and add effect on species richness of animals and plants in the Atlantic forest, and where he concluded that we need more than 30% of forest cover to species richness conservation in the Atlantic forest biome. Another example is this one here in the Cerrado biome, where we can see the decrease of functional connectivity of 45% in 2017, and the importance of connectivity, not only the amount of natural habitats. This case I selected especially for the Victor presentation, but he presented before me, but it's here. And in this context of pandemic, other interesting cases are the modeling risks of zoonotic diseases with hosts, involving hosts and vectors, and it's related with land use. For example, here we have the yellow fever, hantavirus, and leishmania, including the first winner of the MapBiomas Award in the last edition was Lívia Abdala from Fiocruz, that modeled yellow fever in Brazil using also land use change in the MapBiomas data. Just a quick advertisement, we have released the third edition of MapBiomas Award in partnership with Ciência Hoje Institute, and we hope to stimulate more studies using MapBiomas data, and now can be any MapBiomas initiative, including MapBiomas Alert, that is a new system from MapBiomas network that validates deforestation alerts with high resolution images. And also you can send, can also be other studies in other countries involving other MapBiomas initiatives. And the other news is that there is a new category besides the young and general categories, that is the category of public policies, applications on public policy. The deadline is on January 10th, and we have we have 50,000 reais in prizes. But I think that the most important is the communication of these studies. Just to finish, I think like a concluding remarks, that 1/3 of Brazil has been converted to human and modified lands. So emphasize the need to understand biodiversity response to land use changes in the Brazilian biome. And we hope to contribute on understanding the impact of land use change and habitat loss on biodiversity to support effective conservation strategies and policies. For example, to combat deforestation, to indicate priority areas of conservation, indicate areas of restoration. And that is, I think, the contribution of MapBiomas to the biodiversity by providing transparent and more qualified data of native vegetation and land use monitoring in Brazil and other countries, and always trying to improve and with new innovations. Thank you. And all this is possible because we have a collaborative network of institutions and people involved and really well engaged to make change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk, Julia. And I'd like to thank the rest of our speakers as well. We will now begin with the questions and answer section. And I would also like to ask all of our speakers if they could please turn their cameras back on. Please. Victor and Michelle. Thank you. And the first question is from Ana Sofia Lorda. And she is asking, I think it's a question for Victor. She's asking, could you give examples of wildlife-friendly matrices? I think your microphone is off, Victor.
Yes, I didn't realize. Yes, there are many examples of this. Any agroecological system can be a good example, like cacao plantations, coffee plantations. I don't remember the name. Well, there are many plantations that are planted in the shade of the forest. So any plantation of this can be an agricultural biodiversity friendly matrix. But in general, also there are many cattle pastures that can be very friendly if they maintain a high cover of trees, like living fences and isolated trees. So the issue is to maintain as much tree cover as possible in the matrix. So this is my response, my answer.
Okay, thank you, Victor. We have now a question for Maria from Frederic Asante, and I think that Michelle can give some insights about that question too. So the question would be, environmental governance is very important to biodiversity conservation, but the effectiveness of the governance is a problem in most developing states, as for example, in Colombia or other Latin American countries. One of these stagnating issues is due to poverty, hence playing more emphasis on conservation makes communities suffer and become culprit of environmental degradation. How do we solve this?
I suppose that Maria is Ana Maria, or
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first we have to understand what is I won't be talking about the environmental governance, but I will talk about effective governance. And really a fair, good, and effective governance have to include, for example, equity, inclusiveness, efficiency, accountability, and participation, as you know, but also responsibility and transparency. And the legislation has to be impartial. And all of these things and shopping lists that I'm telling to you, it appears like a fairy tale in reality. But those are the main leverage points that we have to seek when we are resolving all the problems that are behind the biodiversity loss. The root causes of biodiversity loss are because we are having problems to seek for these leverage points. For example, the poverty, the hunger, are issues that we have to deal with because we don't have equilibrium or equity and job, economics, and with our social dynamics. So although we don't resolve those problems seeking this fairy tale of the effective governance, we are not going to be really able anyway to seek for a good biodiversity conservation. Is not, and I think that the way around, that implementing legislation and policies to conserve that preempts the development of the societies are not the idea. The idea is how to work together with the society in a very responsible way to create mechanisms for conservation and for sustainability. So it's a bottom-up approach and not an approach that the legislation is first and then the needs for the society and the conservation of the biodiversity. So that maybe that can bring an idea.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I mean, continuing in the line with what Ana Maria said, but the reality often is that conservation projects are funded by people outside of the community that have very clear interests, probably good with regard to conservation. But from the governance perspective, what really helps is co-production and co-creation. So instead of coming into the community and say, this is how we're going to preserve the forest or the coast, it's to work with the community and ask them, what do you understand by this? You know? And how would you go about this? And how would your ancestors have done this? You know? And what would you like to see visioning the future for your own people? And then co-create. And maybe the solutions might not be what the conservationists might want, but it would be solutions that are context specific. And sometimes we run out of time as policymakers and we don't really involve the community. And then the solutions are not as sustainable. So the specific answer, I would think at least one key point is that co-production, co-creation of policies that have to be based on what the community needs. So national policies, for example, probably won't be as effective as going within the community and developing, as Ana Maria says, from the bottom up.
Thank you. This is a question from Filippo Aureli, and he is asking, Julia, how can projects like MapBiomas be done in other countries?
Well, I think that I gave some examples, for example, that happened in the Pan-Amazon, in the Chaco regions in Indonesia. I think that it is involving in training local institutions to map in their countries, to produce their own maps, and involving local expertises in land use change in the country, that they have expertise also in public policies and in remote sensing. So we have this experience in the Pan-Amazon involving local institutions that were training, and they are doing their own mapping, improving their map, and also getting contact with institutions that are going to use the maps in their countries. So that's, I think, it's important, not only to produce the map, but also that the country can use the maps for example, for public policy, not only for science as well.
Thank you, Julia. So we now have another question for Victor. So from Frederick Asante again. So the part the part of the presentation that interested him most was about the positive effect of habitat fragmentation. Could you please talk more about some of the positivities?
Yes. As I have presented in the presentation, having more fragments, because this is something confusing, because most people confuse fragmentation with forest loss. Of course, when we lost forest, we lost species. But the problem here is when you have the same amount of forest, but having a higher number of patches, so different configuration for the same amount of forest, when you have more patches, you have, for example, a lower isolation distance between patches, and this allows the species to move more easily between forest patches, and this increase, of course, habitat resources availability to forest species, and this can also increase the heterogeneity of the world landscape, because different patches can have different soil types and different vegetation, and therefore can have different communities. And with this, if we have different patches in the landscape with different communities, we can have a higher beta diversity, and therefore you can have a more gamma diversity. So the total number of species in the world landscape is higher when you have different patches covering different soil types or different environments, and this is good for biodiversity. Also, when you have different patches, many patches, the spreading of risk, as I said, also is decreased. And also, for example, another thing that I didn't say is that predator-prey dynamics can be more stable in landscape with more fragments, because in some fragments there are no predators, and this can allow the prey to recover after predation. So the predator-prey predation-prey dynamics are more stable in more fragmented landscapes. And of course, there are many others causes of these patterns. We don't know which is the most important. This needs to be evaluated, but maybe it's a combination of all these things. No, more heterogeneity, lower isolation distance, lower splitting of risk, and more complementation. Another important thing, for example, is that different patches may have different resources, and therefore these different patches can complement each other. So the amount of different resources can be higher in a more fragmented landscape. Because when you have all the habitat in a single large patch in a part of the landscape, the rest of the landscape is empty, it's only agricultural lands. So this is why having different patches in different parts of the landscape is so important.
Thank you. Does anybody, Julia, want to add anything? I think we can enhance the debate like this if anyone wants to answer or wants to complement. Okay, Julia, do you want to, or I don't know.
No,
Okay, sorry.
Victor, you can go first.
Yes, no, I only want to add to this that the big problem, the evidence, because something that said Ana Maria that I like it a lot, is that we need to listen to the evidence. And this is the evidence. So for some reasons, the people like the idea of preserving large reserves. So everybody, when I say, having more fragments is good for biodiversity, most people is like surprised because they think, how can he say that? But the evidence say that. It's not me, it's the evidence. The evidence say that when you have a landscape with more fragments, you have more species. And there are many reasons. The ones that I present here are some of them, but there are much more reasons. And there is a paper from Leonard Farig in 2019 in Biological Conservation, where we discuss all these reasons. So this is the evidence, no? But we fight with the evidence. So this is something that happens.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Now we have a question for Ana Maria. As you indicated in your talk from Zach, the question is from Zach, sorry. As you indicated in your talk, we're heading in the wrong direction by many measures. Part of the problem lies with political leadership, but instead of electing leaders who would help to rectify this globally, many countries have elected leaders who only serve to accelerate the problem. Any thoughts on why this pattern persists, even though more and more people in society are becoming aware of our current predicament and precarious state? Good luck with the answer.
No, well, as I was professor at the Javeriana University presenting policy matters to the biologists, it's maybe it's not an easy question, but maybe it's a very interesting question. And maybe I will talk shortly about this. It's just that we don't have any, or we don't receive capacity building on how to participate in our democracy in an informed way. Now, of course, that is not only to the people that can do that without any problem. I mean, in a generally in the cities, everybody can go and go to vote and listen to candidates, but maybe the other reality that we have to take into consideration is that still the politics and the territories are undermined by pressures like illegal pressures, and of course also are undermined with economic incentives. Are not incentives indeed. So in that sense, the people prefers to go to the easy way and not to vote, or first, they don't take the time to read what the plans, the political plans of a candidate. So they vote for a candidate because they're nice, because they have to, or because they don't know what to do. So, okay, let's vote for a woman. No, let's vote for a man. No, let's vote for an indigenous people. So indeed, the people is not conscious. We have to create the conscious, and we have to create the transparent environment for them to vote. And I don't know if the people is prepared really in general to take the time and to analyze what are the candidates are saying, what are the proposals, and how to participate actively in the democracy. So it's complex, but it's something that we have to interiorize as individuals.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Okay, so this is for Michelle from Tamara Hartzell-Skelly. She is from the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, and she says, thank you for your presentation. I was happy to hear that you identified and mentioned the capacity building investment is needed in the region. How do you envision the infrastructure for capacity building? What role do you see existing Caribbean region universities, institutes, or organizations play? All Caribbean region islands need to pull resources together.
Thank you for that question. I think you answered it yourself. Definitely, it's one of the concerns that I have, that as a region, Caribbean islands don't always bring together their own resources for capacity building or for any projects. But I think it's easy to say, well, all these small islands just come together. But that's like saying, why doesn't all Latin America come together? Everybody speaks Spanish anyway, well, except Brazil, but they understand Spanish, you know? Or why all the developing states, everybody's poor anyway, why don't you all come together? I think that saying that ignores the political and historical differences that even though these islands are small, that they have had. So the question becomes, how do people with similar but different historical, cultural experiences work together for solution brokering? Within the political context where each country and each set of politicians wants their party to be recognized for achieving this goal. And I think that's a reality that we can't ignore. So first of all, it's not that easy to come together, to work together on capacity building. That said, CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, it's an integration movement in our region that existed as early as the EU, and it has done a lot in providing that capacity building. So things are happening, but more can happen. That's one. But two, and this is really important, and I would like to say that a lot of the limitations on what we can do come from our funders. Each country tries to get funds for their own projects, yeah? And why is it like that? Because that's the way international funding is structured. Each government wants to say that we got this set of funds for this project, which includes capacity building. And sometimes you find that each island has separate projects and they don't necessarily speak with each other. I'm sure that you find it in your own countries. Different universities have different projects, and not always is there good sharing and capacity building. And I have a study on the Sustainable Development Goals and the problems of the interlinkages between the goals, and it's based on the same funding structure. The funds come for different goals from our international funders, and therefore different departments within one government are working on very similar things under different funding streams. and there's that lack of integration. So lack of integration and governance is a huge problem. And I think the first step is to recognize that it exists. And what you point to in your question is one of the consequences of this lack of integration. And funders, and I've called this out as being important, if you really want to help developing states, focus on integration, focus on ways to make more out of the contribution that you're providing to these states. So thanks for that question, and you're very right.
Thank you, Michelle. I have now a question for Julia. So the question is from Patricia. What changes have you seen in land use in Brazil under the recent Brazilian government? And how has it affected the MapBiomas project?
Very good question. So we all see an increase of deforestation in the biomes, mainly in the Amazon and in the Pantanal biomes that are the most conserved ones. But we are having more work. For example, we have the MapBiomas alert that we validate deforestation alerts from GLAD and from the University of Maryland, the TER from INPE, and also from site from Amazon. We validate these alerts, and we didn't have an idea that we would have so many alerts to validate now. We now are trying to validate all these alerts monthly, but it's being really hard as we have an increase on the deforestation. We have also MOU with the Ministry of Environment and with the IBAMA and ICMBio in Brazil, but things are slowly. I think that before we had a better relation with the government agents, and now I think that it is a little bit slowed down as well. But we are still working with the state governments and other institutions like, for example, federal public ministries that are also using MapBiomas data.
Thank you, Julia. This question is from Ariel Lugo, and it's for Michelle. The question is, what is your view about the relevance of polycentric governance systems to the Caribbean and conservation in general?
Polycentric governance. I think it's very relevant. I think that polycentric governance is not an option, but a reality in our understanding of environmental governance now, not just for the region, but everywhere. I think the challenge is knowing how to tap into polycentric governance for our benefit, because we do have many centers of governance. No longer are states the only architects in the environmental sphere. You have the non-profit sector, NGOs, environmental NGOs, doing a lot in environmental governance in the Caribbean. You also have the private sector, as hotels on their own adopt private certification standards, they protect the environment, and that's not because of national legislation. So recognizing that there are many centers of governance, many centers of decision-making, many centers of rules and regulations, that's important. And I think that polycentric governance is not a goal, but a reality. And the challenge now is to know how to harness all of those multiple actors for our own national development and our own national conservation objectives. So again, I think it's a great question, and recognizing that polycentricity is part of what we now face as we look at environmental governance in the Anthropocene is really the starting point for any good project. Any good project should begin by recognizing polycentricity, I think.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, and actually Michelle needs to leave soon. So I want to thank her and thank all of you for this webinar. I think it has been fantastic, but we have a little time. So I want to ask all of you before Michelle leaves, what do you think is the future of Latin American forests and the Latin American and the Caribbean biodiversity? After seeing these 4 talks, we would like to have your thoughts about this big question that was the motivation of this webinar. And we can start with Michelle if she needs to leave.
Well, if the future is as good as this panel, I think we're in good hands. Because I think we have some very serious, and not just this panel, but I think we have some very serious scientists, very capable scientists in our region. And we have a lot of persons in other regions who are also very concerned about biodiversity, not only for the people of the region, but also for the future of the planet, future generations. And we recognize how crucial this region is for that. No? So it's almost what we have is part of the global commons. And speaking to that reality more and more from the perspective of governance, I think is one of the entry points to bring biodiversity governance in the region to the national agenda. That said, there are challenges. You know, as my colleagues have mentioned, there are many challenges, not just funding, not just resources, but also on the justice elements. From the local level, as Ana Maria was speaking, and local communities and their needs and poverty, etc., to the wider needs of justice of the region. Should our region be the ones funding a lot of this biodiversity governance when many of the problems weren't created by us, for example? So I think the future would be great if we are more cognizant and aware of these issues, even as we draft our proposals for our project that might be very local, to tie into these global dynamics, to tie into these global issues. So I think the future is great. And I think that our region is one that's young and dynamic and is able to address many of these, not without, I think, the support from persons outside of the region as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. We can continue with Ana Maria.
Okay, thank you very much. And I sincerely have words of hope here. The region has been doing great. And as if you compare 10 years ago, the behavior of our society on the streets are totally different regarding the environment and regarding biodiversity. And also our legislation, our policies, and indeed the economics and developing sectors, sectors of development were totally different. Now, I think that by today we have achieved a good way to introduce the needs for a better environment in all the sectors, but of course, by now, we still have a lot of problems trying to dialogue between each other, and I have to reinforce that. We in the scientific community think that we are the only ones that have the right thing, have the truth, and of course, the economic sector says the same, and the other sectors say the same. So. Latin America is an example in a lot of things, in the Caribbean. And well, when we sit together and work together, we can do a lot of things together. And as you can see in our reports and IPBES reports, the Americas is in a good situation in comparison with the other regions of the world. We are not losing biodiversity at the same rates that the other rest of the globe. So we have more opportunities right now, and we're becoming more aware of the problems that we are having. Nevertheless, we have to take one precaution, is that if we are one of the highest biodiversity regions in the world, also we have to understand that any loss of biodiversity here is like 10 losses of biodiversity in other parts of the world. So we have to be aware of that. And but we are doing better each day, and seminars like this one is very important. Finally, we don't have to act as a priest giving mass only to the believers. We have to be a priest that goes and gives the mass to the non-believers. We have to work to the whole world and not only for our friends. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Maria. We can move on with Victor.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a big question. I must be realistic, not pessimistic, but I see the future quite difficult, quite challenging, because if we see these land use changes and the tendencies, we don't see any like a tendency of stopping deforestation. The tendencies are increasing deforestation. So I don't know. I don't know how to, for example, Ana Maria said something that is interesting, that we need to work together, no? to work collectively. And I don't know how to do this, because I understand the point and I agree totally that we need to work together. But how? Because the people, I don't think the people really realize the extinction crisis that we are living now, the climate change. I think that these are something that most people doesn't realmente, I don't know, the people are not worried about this problem. Most people are living like nothing is happening in the environment. And this make me feel like not very hopeful, not with many hopes. So realistically, I see the future quite difficult, but I hope, because I have seen, for example, with this pandemic, that when we have a really crisis in front, we move together. So maybe when these things all become worse, we will move together to shape the planet. So I want to be realistic, and I think there is room for hope, because we see these movements, together, we move together when we see the crisis. But I think that we need to go deeper in the crisis to work like this. So this is my point. I am not very optimistic right now. I don't know how will be the planet when we will move together. I don't know how will be the planet, but I hope we can do together, we all, and the people that is hearing here, and all the coming biologists and conservation biologists and coming politics, to work together to change this, because the tendency is not very, doesn't look very nice. This is my answer.
Thank you, Victor.
And now, Julia?
I will just complement that. I think that we have part of the recipe here with the four of us in our presentations, and we have many challenges ahead. I was just thinking about, for example, just to make it fun a little bit, but in this more heterogeneity landscape that Victor mentions, I was thinking, how are you going to map all these patches in the MapBiomas? But we are getting there. For example, we are mapping cacao plantations, that it's very difficult to map it, and we have a confusion with forests. So I think that the recipe is the collaboration that everybody told, and the collaboration, thinking about Latin America in the countries, but also between countries. We have a question here asking me how this could, MapBiomas could have how in Mexico could have an experience like MapBiomas. I think that we need to put people together, to work together, and that we can go much ahead and further, and that we can learn with each other. So we have the global MapBiomas network, where all the countries are work together to map their own maps, but we learn with each other, and not only with the trainings, but with the analysis, with the publications, to try to involve local institutions. So I think that the collaboration is part of this world that we are living, especially in Latin America, that it's not being easy with the political situation and the pandemic situation as well.
Thank you, Julia. Well, it's near 4. We want to thank again our speakers. We have a lot of questions. I think we can send them to the different speakers and then get back to you guys. I don't know, Alejandra, we have a last question that could be addressed to all. Should we abuse of the generosity of the speakers and maybe go 10 minutes more?
Yes, I think we can go a little longer.
Okay, so it would be a question from Marcela Celi. What do you think about intersectoral policies that change, subsidize, or incentives? For example, reduce subsidies to industrial agriculture and increase subsidies to agroecological forms of food production. Could that make a difference, and what would be needed for promoting policies like those? So if anybody wants to has an idea about that question, it wasn't addressed to any of you. It wasn't specific to any of you. And Michelle, if you need to go, please, thank you again for your time.
I'd just like to thank the organizers. You all have done an excellent job in putting together this webinar, and I'd like to thank the participants as well, very engaged. And I hope to continue seeing webinars like this in the future. Thank you again. Sorry I have to run. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
So again, the question, because I didn't hear really the question.
So what do you think about intersectoral policies, intersectorial policies that change, subsidize, or incentives? For example, reducing subsidies to industrial agriculture and increase subsidies to agroecological forms of food production. Could that make a difference, and what would be needed for promoting policies like those?
I think the answer is in the question, and this is a very good idea. In my opinion, maybe to move to this, we need to change ourselves. For example, when we are buying products, to select these products that are more biodiversity friendly. I am totally in favor of, I don't know, adding some taxes to those environmentally cost products like meat, that is so cheap, the meat, but is so environmentally costly. So I think it's a good idea to move in that direction and to change in that direction. Maybe we ourselves, the consumers, we have the possibility of make this possible. I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Anyone else? Okay, so I want to thank again our speakers, our panelists, and I hope you all the participants too. It was great to have you. A lot of, we had 160 persons connected. That was great. So thank you all, and especially thanks to everyone.
Oh, thank you very much. Organizers, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Thank you all.
For the participants, I'll keep your questions and I'll try to address them to the speakers. And I guess I think we have your email in the list, in the registration box. So we'll try to get back to you.
No.
Bueno, ya no tenemos attendees.
No, ahora.
Los eché a todos.
Vos los echaste.
Los echaste, bueno.
Y los iba echando de uno en uno porque yo creo que hay mucha gente que se queda conectada.
Sí.
Y se va.
Exacto.
Sí. Pero salió muy bien.
Yo creo que
excelente.
Todos los
Excelente.
4 manejados es súper bien. Y la question and answer estuvo buenísimo.
Sí.
Yo ni envié las mías.
Yo
tampoco, yo estaba escribiendo unas ahí, pero las borré ya.
Yo también escribí un montón, pero digo, bien, ya hay bastante. Después los envié en particular.
Yo no sé cómo salvar esto, porque acá no pareciera que me dejara salvar, entonces yo creo que sí.
No, se pierde, yo creo, hay que hacer un
pantallazo, de pronto.
Puede ser screenshots o
screen capture.
Copiar y pegar.
Copy-paste no sirve. Yo creo que copy-paste sirve.
Copy-paste.
Sí, ya. Voy a hacer eso. Y bueno, luego entonces sí hay que hacer la tarea de enviárselas. Hay muchas para Víctor. Y pues si las quiere responder, eso va a ser medio, yo creo que yo después me arrepentí de haber propuesto eso, pero bueno.
More work.
¿Ustedes están pudiendo hacerlo? A mí se me bloqueó un poco el
Déjame ver.
Yo estoy intentando hacer.
Voy a intentar sacar una también.
But maybe
Esa es la pregunta, ¿cierto?
Perdimos algunos, o sea,
Sí.
Patricia y otros, podemos organizar otro Zoom para...
Es que yo me tengo que ir pronto, pero bueno,
Sí.
yo creo que era solo para, pues nada, acá guardemos esto y yo creo que ya pues...
Ay, yo ya las tengo en un archivo Word, ya las logré copiar desde
listo.
el Q&A.
Perfecto.
Te las mando si quieres.
Bueno, listo. Yo descarté como las que eran de agradecimiento, pero las otras, listo. Entonces, pues ya después podemos ver, digamos, encontrar los correos con la lista de registro y la mayoría eran para Víctor.
Okay.
Y 160 participantes al final.
Sí, estuvo muy bien.
Estuvo
¿Cuántos
bien.
de inscritos, cuántos tuvimos? ¿Por ahí el doble, generalmente?
No
Es como el doble, ¿no?
No
Entre
sé,
inscritos.
Lo que yo creo es que funciona más hacerlo así en vivo, ¿no? Porque tal vez cuando es en diferido, la gente realmente no sé qué tanto se conecte, porque nosotros nunca tuvimos tantos conectados. Tuvimos tal vez 60.
Como 40, sí.
Sí. 40, exacto. Creo que es motivante ver la charla en vivo.
Sí.
Ok. Bueno, pues ya.
No, estuvo muy bien. Muy divertido.
Bueno.
¿Y hacemos otra reunión o qué opinan? Para un
cerramiento, pero ahí tenemos que tener una cerveza, creo, ¿no? Como para el final del suceso. Estaba un poco nervioso para decir la verdad antes de todo eso. Cuando vi los atendentes subiendo, yo digo, caramba, qué cool, qué excelente. Estuvo feliz durante todo el tiempo y cuando Michelle dijo que el futuro de la biodiversidad se ve como este panel, yo me lloré acá y dijo, lindo, qué bello.
Está como Michelle, yo creo que...
Sí, podríamos hacer una reunión para hacer un poco un wrap-up de cómo vamos a dejar disponibles la grabación de esto y llegar de vuelta a los asistentes.
Okay.
Me gustaría también saber cuál fue el ratio de ESA para ETVC, participantes o gente que no son de las dos. Entonces sería interesante ver cuánta gente que no es de ni una de las sociedades en verdad cómo se juntó para ver la demanda que hay de esto como afuera, ¿no?
Sería interesante.
Ok, listo.
Tal vez la otra semana o...
¿Ya decidimos ahora o una data? Creo
Puede ser, si es la próxima semana lo dejamos en el mismo día y la misma hora, martes a las 3 p.m. Central.
La próxima semana no puedo porque tengo una entrevista de la visa en el mismo día, entonces para mí no es bueno.
Okay.
Es el mismo horario, es por la tarde, entonces no voy a comprometer con esto.
Pues yo teóricamente voy a estar en vacaciones, no sé si está en Bogotá, pero si estoy por acá disponible me conecto a la hora que ustedes organicen. Las 2 próximas semanas.
O lo podemos a las 2 próximas 2 semanas.
Sí.
Ok.
Pero
Bien,
bueno,
yo voy, déjeme ver.
me conecto, no hay problema. Estoy principalmente de vacaciones del Humboldt, entonces ya con eso me descarga bastante.
Podemos darnos una semana ahí de descanso después de toda la furia y reunir la última semana de noviembre, tal vez, ¿no?
¿Listo?
Ah,
Bien.
sí.
Sí,
Perfecto.
listo.
Entonces sería el martes 24.
Sí, podría ser.
Ah,
Bien.
Yo puedo.
disculpe. Mi entrevista es en 18, yo estoy confundido acá. Si es en 17, yo puedo, disculpe. Mi entrevista en
Pero puede
verdad es
ser
18.
en 15 días como, o
Sí,
sería, sí, en 15 días.
24.
Para
Ujú.
sí, el 24 está bien.
Ok.
Ok,
Ok.
listo.
¿La misma hora es a las 2 o a las 3? Yo no recuerdo.
A las 2.
A las
A
2.
las 2. ¿Colombia o sea este?
Sí. A la 1
Bueno,
CST.
A las 2 horas, como hoy, sí. Juan
Ok.
como hoy, sí.
¿Cómo es?
Perfecto.
justo ahorita porque me dijo es a las 2 o a las 3 y yo, ay, ahora Ana María va a llegar una hora tarde, pero
No,
no.
no. Es que creo que yo me inscribí, es que creo que pasó algo raro, porque yo me inscribí incluso antes de que estuviera todo listo y el webinar y todo para ver el formato de inscripción y todo. Yo me inscribí y me llegó un correo y en ese correo creo que había algo raro con las horas. O sea, algo se confundió en el sistema, pero me apareció. Era una reserva, no lo había hecho yo, era uno de esos que viene un attachment así y yo,
Ujú.
oh no, este no es. Wrong time.
Todo salió maravilloso.
Sí, sí.
Súper bien.
Todo perfecto. Muchas gracias. Sí, fue un
Bueno,
trabajo
Nos
muy
vas a
duro.
mandar el link entonces para el 24.
Ah, yo pido para Marcel.
listo.
Ay,
Vale.
Ok.
Listo.
Ok.
Súper.
ok.
Perfecto.
Bueno,
Nos estamos viendo.
que estén
Que
muy bien.
tengan buena
Bye,
tarde.
bonito
Que estén
día.
muy
Muy
bien.
bien.
Chao.
Nos vemos. Chao.
Chao, chao.